Hello, this is Michael Garino, and I'm going to give you a quick tour of how to deploy n8n using Plural. For those who are not familiar, n8n is kind of, you can think of it as a hybrid of Zapier and IFTT, but open source and self-hostable. It allows you to integrate various different SaaS solutions or also internal tools using webhooks, and then also has a nice workflow manager to provide more complicated logic in those integrations. But for the purpose of Plural, we're going to show you how to actually deploy that n8n instance on a Kubernetes cluster of your choosing in either GCP, Azure, or AWS. The first step is to go to the Cloud Shell, which is that second icon from the top left, and you can see our standard onboarding flow. The first screen in that flow allows you to create a personalized onboarding session. That will actually be with me, but will allow you the opportunity to have a handheld guide through the creation of your first cluster using Plural. If you had any issues that you wanted to get fixed immediately, I would be happy to walk you through those. But if you're feeling confident, you can just go right to it and get started. And if you click that page, you will then see the option to either use your own cloud or our free demo. The demo experience is basically an on-the-fly GCP project that we created in our own organization that's meant to serve as a sandbox for you to be able to deploy a few apps and get a test run of Plural and the experience. It's a time-gated 6-hour demo project, so it's not going to be around forever, but it's a good way to get your feet wet with Plural. We feel confident though, so we're going to use our own cloud. Then you have the option to use the Cloud Shell or the CLI. The pros cons of the two is the Cloud Shell is an on the Rails experience that will allow you to basically do the entire flow in the browser, and it'll guarantee that things like Cloud CLIs are configured correctly, and that all the CLIs, the Plural CLI, Terraform, so on and so forth, are installed in our Cloud Shell instance. If you use the local CLI, it's actually a completely secure installation. You won't ever give us access to any of your Git repos. You won't give us access to any of your cloud environments. You have the maximum amount of security and privacy for your installation, and if that's something that your business requires, we would definitely encourage you to use it. But we're going to use the Cloud Shell for the purpose of this demo. The next phase is to create a Git repository that's used to save the state of your application and all the infrastructure as code resources, the Terraform and Helm needed to actually provision it in your cloud. Awesome. And we just need to give that repository a name. So we're going to give it a pretty obvious name, n8n demo, and continue on. And then we'll just use GCP because it's relatively easy, and find a service account file to provide as the credentials for that GCP instance. And then it's going to ask us to give a name for the cluster, a bucket prefix that's simply used to duplicate S3 or GCS buckets, which are typically globally unique within the entirety of AWS or GCP systems. And then we're going to give a subdomain to register all the DNS entries that are needed for the services that we're going to spin up. Then finally, going all the way through, it's going to create a pod in one of our Kubernetes clusters to actually host the Cloud Shell. It takes a little bit of time, but it should be up in about 30 seconds or so. Great. Awesome. Now that the terminal is ready, we can actually continue with installing n8n. So we're just going to go through the installation wizard here. It's going to ask us some basic questions on some resources that need to be configured. Things like buckets, we think it's typically perfectly fine for you to just use the defaults, but if you'd rather name it, you can. And then we're going to give a host name for our n8n instance. And then go on and click install. So the command that's running now is the plural build command that basically is scaffolding the entire repo. There's going to be a lot of Helm and Terraform code that's generated. The nice thing is you actually have the ability to customize that code. So if you wanted to, say, add a VPC peer or add your cluster to your transit gateway, entirely doable if you wanted to flip out um, the on cluster Postgres instance for a managed Postgres instance. You're fine with the cost versus reliability trade off. You also have the ability to do that, and it's a relatively easy and documented process on how to do it. Once the build command is done, it's now doing the plural deploy command, and that's just basically executing all the Terraform and Helm in topological order to make sure that the entire cluster is spun up correctly. The Bootstrap application is the first one always, and that actually contains the Kubernetes cluster itself. So it takes a little bit longer to complete. Can take 10, 15, 20 minutes, just depending on how quick the cloud of your choosing is in provisioning Kubernetes. Awesome. As you can see, the plural deploy command is finished. And there's a few things that have changed in the UI, as you could probably also tell. So there are some launch buttons next to console and n8n. Both of these are web-facing applications that have a interface that you can actually log into. And so we have these buttons available to just jump right to those applications. There's also this readiness indicator on the right next to the launch button as well that gives you a sort of at-a-glance view of the state of Kubernetes' provisioning of the applications. The plural deploy command is just showing you basically that the manifests have been accepted by the Kubernetes control plane, but there's still the problem of placing all the pods, configuring the networking, maybe arranging a few disk resources and such stuff like that before it's fully ready to be used. If you want to get a little bit more detail into what's going on, you can actually run the plural watch command, which we'll do right now to see what's going on with the console. And you can see the console's database is actually running. So sometimes the health check can be a little bit laggy, but you can also run the kubectl describe command that we recommend you to get a bit more detail into what's going on. And you can see in this case, the certificate is also actually completely issued. So a lot of the stuff is actually basically ready to go, and it's just that the health checker just needs to sort of catch up to the current status of the application. Another thing that can sometimes be useful is you can just run kubectl get pods in app name and see the status of all the pods for that app. We'll do the same with n8n as well, and you can see a lot of these are actually running too. So we'll give it a little bit of time just for the health checks to fully stabilize, but I believe both of these applications are actually ready, and you can see they are. Cool, and you can see all the applications available to this cluster. So we just installed the console n8n, sorry, and you can dive into all the features that the console provides you to manage the application. So there's dashboards to understand the health of the Postgres database, some runbooks to scale both Postgres and your n8n instance. It's worth mentioning that n8n has a fairly complicated topology, so it has a worker tier, a web server tier, and a webhook tier, all of which can be scaled independently, and you can do that all with the runbooks we give you. Some of the data is obviously not populated because this cluster is very, very fresh, but there will be time series data for all these runbooks, which we could probably show you in a few minutes. You can see all the Kubernetes components if you wanted to dive that deeply into the application. So you can see the pods for the web server deployment. You could delete one if for whatever reason it was misbehaving, and you can also dive into the logs of that pod if you thought there was a need to get a little bit more information, or you can see the logs of the entire application aggregated all in the console as well. This can be very helpful for troubleshooting. Some other things that might be useful is cost analysis. If you install kubectl, you can see that. You can reconfigure the n8n instance's Helm chart directly in the console. But yeah, there's a lot of really useful management features for n8n specifically available here. We can also just launch the n8n instance directly here and go through the onboarding experience that n8n typically provides. So we'll just fill in this form right here. And get into our instance. Cool. And yeah, so we have a completely working n8n instance available. You could start creating a workflow using everything n8n has to offer. Um, we definitely encourage you to look into the resources they provide on how to use the application to its fullest. It is actually quite powerful, so we think there's a lot to learn there. One other thing I would want to mention as something that can be done as well is you can actually configure SMTP globally for your cluster. So you can configure email settings right here if you filled out this form, and then you can create a quick build for your n8n instance after filling it out to redeploy, and it will actually configure your n8n installation to use the SMTP credentials that you created. That's going to be super useful for delivering emails as a part of the workflows that you're using with n8n, and is a nice universal feature. With Plural, there's other applications that might be useful to have email integration with, something like Chatwoot, for instance, for customer support, or GitLab as well for sending pull request emails. But otherwise, yeah, so that's a quick tutorial of how to deploy n8n. We hope it was useful for you. And if you happen to want to create a self-hosted scalable n8n installation, we hope you consider Plural in the future. All right, bye-bye.